Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our discussion of philosophy of food. For this module, in week three, we are going to turn our attention to a Kantian approach to famine relief, which is the title of the article by Ornora O'Neill, which you should have read for this week for this module. So the basic idea for this module is we're going to take a non-consequentialist approach. Remember, in the previous week, we considered Singer's approach to global famine, global hunger, and food justice. And of course, Singer is a utilitarian, and he's using specifically a utilitarian or consequentialist approach to this problem. So now we're going to turn to Kantian deontology and this sort of non-consequentialist approach. All right, so let's begin by just simply thinking about how we should understand what our moral obligations actually look like. What do we mean when we're talking about moral obligations? Well, again, remember from last week, we talked about how when we say you have a moral obligation, this is a kind of a requirement, a moral duty, a moral responsibility that somebody has, not something that you can just, turn your nose to or just ignore because you don't feel like doing it. All right. So if you have a moral obligation to do X and you fail to do X, then you've done something morally wrong by failing to do that thing. So if you think back to last week, remember that we used this idea that if you have the ability to help somebody, let's say a starving child on the other side of the world somewhere, well, since you can help, then that implies that you ought to help. That was an important claim, an important premise that played a role in Singer's argument. But we might question that. We might wonder to what extent we actually need to rely upon this can implies ought principle. But recall what exactly Singer says. Singer told us that if it is within our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, then we ought to do it. Right? We have a moral obligation such that if we fail to do that thing, we've done something wrong. So if I decide to spend a few dollars on a coffee and I decide not to send that same amount of money to help some starving children, then I'm doing something morally wrong by failing to do what I ought to do. And remember, there were several cases that we considered when thinking about this can implies ought principle. There was a video where we talked about this principle in more detail, and I gave the example of Superman, who could maybe save a child who's falling to their death in the Grand Canyon. Right, so that's what I'm calling the Superman Grand Canyon case here. There also could be like a kiddie pool case or the sort of case that Singer mentions, which involves, a drowning child in a shallow pond. These were the sorts of cases that seem to motivate the idea that if we can help, then we ought to help. We have an obligation to help. However, I think that it's important to get clear about what exactly we mean by this term obligation. Yes, we can say that we have some sort of obligation such that if we failed to do that thing, we've done something morally wrong. We have some sort of duty or responsibility, but we need to get clear what exactly that means, right? What do we mean when we say you have a moral obligation to help those that are in need? That's going to be one of the key focuses that we need to pay attention to in this particular module. So I think there's at least several ways that we can understand what's going on here. On the one hand, we might say that to have a moral duty or obligation means that you're in a position to prevent any and all serious harms whenever we reasonably can. Now, notice that that's a very, very strict rule, right? That duty is telling us that we have an obligation to help prevent any and all serious harms. That's quite a strict rule. So we might think that we want something a little bit more flexible, right? So then we might interpret the obligation here to mean, well, if you have a moral duty or obligation, that means that you're in a position to prevent the most serious harms whenever you reasonably can, but not any and all serious harms, right? So that's a little less strict. But notice that it still means that you have a duty to do quite a bit, right? Indeed, you have a duty to prevent the most serious of harms, assuming that you reasonably can. Now, finally, there's a third way to approach this. You might think that really what it means to have this sort of moral duty or obligation, it just means that you're in a position to prevent some subset of harms, but it's in your choice. It's up to you to decide which harms in this subset of harms are you going to choose to prevent when you reasonably can. So these are kind of three different approaches, three different ways of understanding what we mean by having this moral duty, moral obligation. And I want you to think about which one applies most plausibly or most reasonably to the situation with regard to food justice and global hunger. So let's consider how this would apply to what Singer had to say. Remember, Singer offers this notion of a rule of rescue, where Singer's notion of the rule of rescue just means that if you can help somebody, then you have the obligation to help somebody. That's just what he means here by rule of rescue. It's essentially the can implies ought principle. Well, this rule of rescue or the can implies ought principle, it seems that it only works when we interpret the obligation in terms of A, which says that it's to prevent any and all serious harms whenever we reasonably can. Another way to put this point is that if we interpret what we mean by having a duty or obligation, if what we're saying is that we should interpret that as either B or C, then the argument simply will not go through. Singer's argument is not going to go through. So we're going to want to think about why that's the case, especially given that it seems that A is way too strong, right? When we say that you have a moral obligation to prevent any and all serious harms whenever you reasonably can, that's asking quite a bit of people. Indeed, we saw this sort of objection last week when we thought about whether or not this sort of view is just far too demanding. It's asking too much of us. It's too strict in some regard. Or we might just say that it's way too radical of a view. It's asking way too much, far more than anybody would actually ever do. Still, what sort of objections can we offer against A, right? If this is going to be the best or most plausible way to understand what this obligation means, then what objections can we offer against it? Likewise, we need to think about what sorts of reasons there may be to accept either B or C. Remember where B says that we have a moral obligation to prevent the most serious of harms when we reasonably can. And C tells us that we have a moral obligation or duty to prevent some subset of these harms, but it's up to us to make the decision on which of those harms we're going to try to prevent. So these are some of the issues that we're going to need to think about and consider as we're trying to understand what is the best interpretation of what we mean by this moral obligation or this moral duty that we have to help. All right, well, one thing that we might say is that it's just simply not very clear why serious harms caused by famine and poverty should necessarily entail a moral claim on us, while others may not. What about other serious harms? Right? Do these other harms, do they also entail a moral claim on us? This is, for instance, why the altered pond example might make a lot of sense. Remember, we talked about this with regard to Timmerman's, a revised version of the shallow pond case. There's just so many different forms of suffering out there in the world, so many different things that are happening. Why should we choose famine and poverty instead of something else? Why is this necessarily entailing a moral claim on us, but something like preventing war is not? Why not decide to prevent some other kind of equally bad form of harm? Maybe something like political persecution or illiteracy, racism, war, sexism, all sorts of terrible things that are occurring in the world. Famine and poverty are amongst those terrible things. But why are we focusing on famine and poverty and not something else? It looks like we just don't have a clear answer to this. What criteria could we possibly use that might be available to choose between these? What criteria would Singer offer to say that famine and poverty is the one harm that we should really focus on? I mean, clearly it is really bad. It is really terrible. But so is racism. So is sexism. So is illiteracy. So are so many different things. And that means that we might question this principle that if you can do something to help, then that implies that you ought to do something to help. So another way to think about this point then is that according to A, it looks like A just is asking too much of us. One might object to A by pointing out that it falls victim to the same sorts of objections that a utilitarian ethics generally does. It makes a moral agent or a person like you or me into a kind of harm reducing mechanism and a kind of calculation, right? It's treating us as robots or as mechanisms in reducing harm rather than as moral agents or as human beings with rationality and choice and values, right? Instead, we're being treated merely as harm minimizing conduits in order to carry out some form of utilitarian ethics. And you might think that that's a really serious objection, right? This seems to destroy the personal integrity of a moral agent, the personal integrity, the rationality that you have, that I have, that we all seem to have. Indeed, you might think that this is profoundly alienating for a moral agent. We're being sort of torn apart in two different directions. On the one hand, we have these moral obligations to prevent all these different harms, and at the same time, we are moral agents, and we have our own decisions, our own values, our own goals, the things that make us happy in our lives. So, if we accept the first interpretation A of what we mean by having a moral obligation, and remember, what this interpretation says was that to have a moral obligation means that you've got a duty, a requirement to prevent as many serious harms, any and all serious harms, insofar as you reasonably can. Well, if we accept that interpretation, then it looks like the moral agent is merely a harm minimizing mechanism in this sort of utilitarian calculus. Yet, at the same point, moral agents are more than harm minimizing mechanisms. So then it looks like, according to Modus Tollens, we should reject the interpretation that says we have a moral obligation to prevent any and all serious harms when we reasonably can, which is just another way of saying that we should reject A. Yet at the same point, somebody might respond to this sort of objection by saying that this notion of reasonably can is actually doing a lot of work here, a lot of philosophical work. Yet at the same point, notice that this would just move from the very strong interpretation of A, which is requiring quite a bit of us, it's very, very demanding, to a much weaker interpretation of C, which would say something like to prevent some subset of serious harms of our own choosing whenever we reasonably can. But notice that if that's the interpretation that we have of what we mean by having a moral obligation or a moral duty, then it doesn't seem like Singer's argument is going to be able to go through. It's not clear that Singer can establish the strong claim that we have this moral duty or obligation to donate so much of our income, such that if I buy a coffee without also donating to prevent starving children from dying, then I'm doing something morally wrong by buying that coffee, right? C is a much weaker interpretation that would allow for me to make all kinds of different decisions in order to prevent some subset of serious harms, but not necessarily the ones that Singer recommends. Likewise, notice that this would seem to preserve my autonomy, my rational choice, which you might think that is actually a very nice aspect of this interpretation, the C interpretation that says I have a moral obligation to help prevent some subset of serious harms whenever I reasonably can, right? Because it's up to my own rational choice to decide which harm it is that I'm going to prevent. Likewise, this seems to preserve this notion of supererogatory actions, which, as we can recall from the previous module, it looked like one of the problems, one of the objections for Singer's argument was it seemed to make supererogatory actions, or this notion of charitable actions, it seemed to make it, in some sense, meaningless or incoherent. But that seems absurd. Of course, we know what charity means. We know what it means to perform some supererogatory actions. Even if you had never heard of that word before, you understand the concept once I explain it to you. And so this interpretation of C seems to allow us to preserve this notion as well, which again seems to be a strong feature of this interpretation. So then we might think that this suggests that we've got some good advantages for why one might accept C instead of the much more radical interpretation of A. Now, I think it's really interesting to point out that this interpretation C also kind of makes a lot of sense when we're thinking about Kantian deontology, which tells us that in addition to having various duties and obligations to help other people whenever we can, we also have various duties and responsibilities or obligations to adopt ends for ourselves. And that's because, according to Kantian deontology, morality is not only other directing, but it's directed at ourselves too. We have moral obligations and duties to ourselves because we are also rational agents. And so we need to make sure that we're respecting everybody's rational agency, everybody's rational autonomy, not just other people, not other rational agents only, but ourselves included. We are also rational agents, so we need to consider our own desires, our own choices, our own values, and what we want to do in our lives as well. And so the C interpretation makes a lot of sense in this regard. For example, it may be true that I have some sort of duty or obligation to help starving children whenever I reasonably can, but I also have a duty to adopt ends for myself. Maybe I need to focus on my own research because that's a part of my job. So then it looks like the ends that I adopt for myself is of my own rational choice, my own autonomous choice. So it's not some form of compulsory decision that I'm making. I'm not being forced or coerced into doing this sort of thing. I'm not merely some sort of harm reducing mechanism in a utilitarian calculation. And these are what Kant calls imperfect duties, which involves balancing various duties via rational reflection and, well, essentially doing philosophy. Sometimes we have to make decisions about what duties are we going to fulfill. Sometimes I need to focus on things that are important in my own life, and other times I can focus on things, maybe helping starving children, or maybe helping somebody at a food bank, or passing out coats during the wintertime, right? And so that kind of involves making these decisions through rational reflection, which again is essentially doing some philosophy. So we considered the interpretation of this moral obligation that says we have a duty to help any and all serious harms whenever we possibly can, and we've also seen this other interpretation C, which says that we have a duty to help some subset of these sorts of harms, but it's up to us to make a decision. But now, what about B? What about the interpretation that says to have a duty or obligation to do such and such just means that we must prevent the most serious of harms whenever we actually possibly can? What about this interpretation of what it means to have a moral duty or obligation? Well, the first thing that we should ask is, what exactly do we mean by the most serious harms? Which ones are going to count as the most serious harms? And even if we accept that poverty and children dying of starvation is in some important sense a very serious moral problem, we still might ask, is it really the greatest and most serious of harms? Because it looks like in order for Singer's argument to work, we're going to have to say that children dying of starvation is the most serious of all possible harms, if this is the interpretation of what we mean by a moral obligation or duty. Yet at the same point, you might think that that's a bit of a stretch. You might wonder, are there other more serious harms than starving children or people living in poverty? Well, if so, if you think it is the case, well, then we would actually be morally obligated to help in those situations, in those ways, instead of donating our money to help starving children or people living in poverty. So again, it looks like we would not be able to use this interpretation B of what it means to have a moral obligation in order to make Singer's argument go through. So we've been considering some of the different ways to interpret what it actually means to have a moral obligation, to have this sort of moral duty. And it looks like the only interpretation that's going to work, according to Singer's argument, is A. But as we've seen previously, A is just far too radical. It's asking way too much, and it's just too demanding on most interpretations. And it looks like if we go with the B interpretation, that one's not going to work either. And then if we go with C, it looks like then the decision is up to us because we have a moral duty to ourselves as well. And it's with this third interpretation, C, that I think opens up the Kantian view in more detail. So that's what we're going to consider in the next video.